Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Unity RPG tutorial. So in this tutorial we're going to be adding a little bit more to our spell system again. So in this part we are going to be adding a spell book. So we've already got an actual player spell set up, which is pretty much acting as our spell book, but we haven't actually displayed it on a GUI element so we know which spells we've actually acquired from the NPC. So when we actually go up and buy the spells from the NPC, we want them to go into our spell book, and then from there we want to be able to drag these spells at any time that we want onto our spell bar and use them. So the first thing we're going to do is just jump into our code, because we don't really have to do anything new in Unity. So from here I'll scroll up real quick, and we're going to be adding a couple of new variables. So what I added was a blank icon. So what this is going to be used for if the actual button itself does not have an element. So if it doesn't have a spell currently equipped to that slot, it's just going to display a blank slot. Now you could do this with using the actual background for the spellbook itself. So if a slot is empty, it just won't show an icon on top of it, it'll just be blank. But in this case, just for testing, since we don't have a background setup with that kind of texture, we're just going to be using a blank icon for that space. So if a button does not have a spell currently, we're just going to make it blank. And then from here we're going to add another bool, which is player spell menu show. So this is actually for showing and displaying the player's spell menu and showing which spells we've currently acquired in that spell menu. So that's all we need for that. So we can scroll down to our code. Let's just close that real quick. And let's see here. So this was for our spell NPC menu, displaying that. So now we actually want to set up a menu for displaying the spells that we currently have once we buy them. So the first thing we're going to set up is a GUI button. And this is going to act as just a button to bring up and show your spell menu for the spells that you've acquired, or hide the menu. So depending on what we press, it will either hide or show that menu. And from this point, we're going to say if the player spell menu show is true, we're going to want to display our actual menu for our spells. So what I did was just made another blank background, just a plain black background that I've used from the previous tutorial. And then from here, we're going to be doing a couple of for loops to actually display which spells we have. So for the first for loop, we're going to be doing the different rows and columns for each one. And from here, we're just going to be displaying 2 across and then 4 down. So I can go demonstrate that in game real quick. So once we get in the game, we have a little button down here. So as we can see, we display 2 across and 4 down. And that'll give us all our spell slots for now. In the future, we can add a little bit more, or we can add different buttons for the different pages. So we're probably going to make it so the player can have a large amount of spells, but instead of taking up the whole entire screen with a big book, we're just going to have a small element that we can scroll through the different pages and see all the different spells that we have. What we could also do is categorize them into different spell categories. So if you had fire spells, frost spells, or anything like that, depending on your class, you could have passive and all that. So that's pretty much the basic setup for that. And from here, what we're going to be doing is displaying each one of the buttons. So the first thing that we're going to check for, I guess this is not entirely aligned. Okay, I guess we got it set up there. So the first thing we're going to do is actually check if the icon is null. So we checked this last time, that if our player spells did not have an icon, it meant that there was not a spell in that slot. So we're going to be also using that for displaying. So if there is currently no spell in that slot for the player's spellbook, we're going to be displaying a blank button that has the blank icon texture, which is just going to be a pink texture, which is what you saw before since we didn't have any spells in there. And when we click on it, it just says no spells here. Now what you could also do is either just not include this code at all and have it as the background texture as just being blank if you have not acquired a spell for that slot, or what you could do is create a GUI texture and just put a blank icon on there. For now, we're just going to leave it as a button just so we can click on it and see that there's no spell there, but either way works. So if it does not equal null and we actually have a spell in that slot, then we want to display which spell it is. So we're going to go through and display the button, and we're going to be checking which spell number it is for that slot. So in this case, if we scroll up here, pretty much spell num, as we go through these for loops, we're going to be adding to our spell num. So we don't want to put it at the top because we want to reference the first slot, which is 0. So we want to just count up after we've displayed the very first slot. In that case, your first slot in your array might not show up if you put this at the top. But depending on how many spells we have, we'll just loop through all that. So right now you see that we're not using length. So in this case, I mean, you could display multiple pages, or you can actually calculate the length and how many times you want to actually go through this for loop. So you could have another for loop that keeps track of that and only display up to that many spells. But in this case, we're just going to be displaying whatever number that we want for now, just for the first page. And so from here, we're going to be, let's see here, we're going to be displaying the icon that we want. So each spell has its own icon that we put in, and we're going to be grabbing which icon that spell is related to. So whichever spell we buy, it's going to be the one that's plugged into our array, and that's what's going to be reading the actual icon for that spell. And Gui Style.none will pretty much take away all the other elements. So for your actual GUI element, you could create a new Gui style and put it in here. That way when you hover over the button, you can add in a texture for actually hovering over the button or clicking on a button. But for now, it's just going to take away all the elements that would be displayed with a normal button. So I should demonstrate that real quick. So this is a normal button right here. If you see, we scroll over and it's got a little highlight. And if we bring this up, it doesn't have any highlight or anything like that. So you'd have to create your own GUI style and create a button setup, maybe transparent, for hovering over these different elements. And that's how you get it to display. So in any case, we'll go back in here. And I've pretty much gone over everything. And in this case, when we actually click on the spell in our spell inventory, I don't want it to activate the spell. I want the player to have to drag the spell onto their action bar in order to use it. So in this case, when we click the spell, we're just going to be displaying the spell name in the console log. So for just testing, we just want it set up like that. If you wanted to make the spell actually activate, you can do what we did before with the actual buttons, where we click the button and it uses the spell, depending on which spell it is. So you just go in here and just set that up with spell num for which one you want to actually activate. And it'll call that spell. So if you want to use the spell from the actual spell menu for the player, that's what you would do. So if we go back in here, so we can open and close the menu. In the future, we do want to set it up so when there's no other element over here, we want to move this element over. And you see that a lot in RPGs where they can stack up to 3 windows. And as you close the windows will move over and open and close other windows. But since we don't really have too much of our inventory set up right now, we're just using this for testing and displaying. So if we go in here, actually one more thing I want to show you guys beforehand. Just make sure when you create that blank icon, if that's what you're going to be doing, that you set it up in here. And also for your spells, you want each spell to have a different icon just so you can check to make sure that the spells are being included in your spell book as you're buying them. So those are the only things that I changed for this. So if we go and we click on an icon, at first it'll say no spell here, which is true since our array of the player spells, if we go in here, are blank. So it's checking the icon, it's checking that we don't currently have any spells in our player spells array, but when we actually go to buy a spell, it will add it to the array. So the first slot's plugged in here, and you can see that it's displaying. And we click on the button, now that's our spell 1. So in the future, we want to make it so we can click and drag down to an action bar, and then you click on the spell and use the spell from there. And if we add spell 2, you can see if we click it, it will display spell 2 on here. And then all these other ones, no spell, we can add spell 2 again. And in the future, yes, we would want to remove each spell that we have bought, so we don't get multiple spells within this inventory here. But yeah, that's a basic way of setting up a simple spell book. We will be doing more stuff in the future with this, but for now we just wanted to lay it out with our basic setup. So yeah, I will see you guys in the next tutorial.